A beginning is a very delicate time. If you screw it up and fail to provide exposition, then the hook for everything that follows may be lost. Know then that it is the year NCC 2199. In this time, Frank Herbert parodies have come back into fashion as the Earth has been turned into Arrakis, Dune, desert planet. Humanity is under assault by the Gamalas, an empire seeking to bring all known space under their dominion, who have found the Terran race to be hostile to that end, and thus seek our extermination. All our advancements into space have been lost. Our space colonies, our installations on the outer planets, gone, annihilated by either their superior forces, or them mass-accelerating poisoned asteroids to demolish everything. The assaults terraforming the planets hit into desolate wastelands. Free space travel and navigation rendered impossible, as the United Earthsphere Federation's Space Force is, battle by battle, annihilated, beyond the losses already wrought upon them from prior conflicts attempting to maintain the totalitarian control of the government of the prior Universal Century. Because if you've never realized it, the Universal Century's Earth Federation is literally a fascist authoritarian government. That isn't fandom reinterpretation. Its acts of oppression are literally something stated about it in multiple Universal Century Gundam series, and is the inciting cause of most of the conflicts in that sect of the Gundam franchise, as their oppression is what starts the formation of the other factions that come into power. Oh, Zeon may have all the visual gimmicks people associate with Nazis, but yes, the Feds are the actual wealthy political racial supremacist elitists terrorizing everyone into submission with authoritarian politics and policies that are the actual hallmarks of the Nazis. And now, in this cross-series amalgamated version of the timeline, their style of government is the one that brought this down on everyone's heads. As remember from my starting spiel on Super Robot Wars, unless there is an implicitly stated difference, you treat the backstory material as if it happened in their respective canons. If they actually change something from how it was in canon, they let you know. And heads up for all the Super Robot Wars games, they try to fix the Universal Century Gundam series' timeline more than any other that they mash up into these games. Some succeeding more than others depending on what parts they try to fix. Though usually if the writers focus on Char Aznable being what screws everything up, then they actually end up missing the root problem entirely. One of the last fleets engages the Gamellan forces out in an orbit of Pluto, commanded by Captain Juzo Okita, and that is even then fighting a losing battle. Their weapons literally not able to harm the alien fleet as they just don't have enough of a punch to do significant damage. And as I inferred, the Earth Federation Space Forces have been so devastated that they have no mobile suits to spare. I mean, this kind of fleet-based actions, yeah, mobile suits were literally designed originally to be ship killers and cripple fleet actions. Regardless of 99% of the fleet being destroyed, they've managed their objective, and the escaping ship, the Amaterasu, manages to make it into the inner systems near Mars. Okita ordering a withdrawal of all remaining forces, but his subordinate, Mamoru Kodai commanding the ship the Yukikaze, refuses, using the Yukikaze to delay pursuit of those who are left, so their lives may be spared, and succeeds at the cost of the ship and himself. And wow, researching the backstory for the property this ties into gave me some amusing thematic parallels. On Mars, Mamoru's younger brother, Susumu Kodai, is part of the team that recovers what the Amaterasu went in-system to deliver, but was shot down in doing so. All that's left being sent out in an escape pod, an alien woman named Sasha, and a drive core central to the function of a new type of ship engine. Back on Earth, though, we meet our actual main protagonists for this game, Soji Murakumo and Chitose Kisaragi. Not familiar with either of those names? Well, I wouldn't have expected anyone to be unless they played this game. They are two of the original characters for this game. See, what Super Robot Wars does to facilitate the amalgamated world setting isn't just to smash stories together, but mold them together like clay. The original characters and setting elements acting like the water that softens the clay to make it malleable and reshape it, while still allowing it to retain its prior existence. And to be clear here, they aren't here to overtake anyone's story. No, they have their own story that plays out as part of the games.
but they also act as the viewpoint character for the audience to facilitate the other stories around them.
Unique to these games as well, you get to select who you play as. Either Soji, whose backstory has him as a burnt-out pilot survivor of the wars that just doesn't have it in him to go back to the front lines, thus is currently employed as a military courier, and Chitose, who is a scientist and engineer. And for this playthrough I went with Soji, as it makes more sense for a pilot to be in control of a mobile suit. However, there is a difference in how the story of the main game goes down depending on who your protagonist is, as both Soji and Chitose have their own impacts on the plot and their own personal story, to further show that while they may be small, the way your story plays out does have some divergences from the choices you make.
Though as you can change the characters' names, blood types, and birth dates, with Soji's appearance here and my love of Zone of the Enders, I really should have changed Soji's name to Dingo Egret. I legitimately kept forgetting to do so. But regardless, that feeling of freedom and player choice having relevance to the depiction of the journey is also something that really makes you invest your time to replay the games as well. There are divergent story paths that give you different focuses on what you see play down. There are secret requirements for unlocking special units and special characters, and if you don't unlock those yourself, they can show up as enemy units instead of being recruitable. Or they can even die. Hell, there are multiple possible endings. Even beyond that, the further into the games you get, the more usable units you have, more than you can field at any time. So, different laps through the games can allow you to completely change who you use and what you focus on doing with them. The Super Robot Wars aren't just great for the crossovers, there's actually a lot of tangible replay value here.
And there's more to New Game Plus, too. As you complete each stage, you are given two types of currency, standard money and tactical points. The standard credits are used to upgrade the capabilities of your units all up to level 10. At level 5 in stats, the unit unlocks a special ability, and at level 10 a unit gains a bonus point in a stat, either gaining 1 more movement speed per turn, limit breaking a type of terrain they're better at fighting on, another slot for equipment, and so on. I, however, tend to exclusively give my units the move 1 extra space per turn bonus, simply because mobility in moving around the maps is centrally important to being good at and meeting the bonus objectives in these games, so every extra space you can move can be game-breaking.
Well, that and a lot of units are pretty slow, especially the ones out of the Universal Century timelines, which is baffling to consider when they're being outspeed by robots the size of battleships. So some of them are in desperate need of any speed boost you can supply.
The other currency, TAC points, is used to purchase either equipment unit upgrades, to increase the capabilities of a given pilot with skills such as full countering an enemy's actions, being able to use their own special skills, or being able to attack twice in a single engagement.
And speaking of, I love giving the second attack skill to pretty much any unit with remote weapons, for pretty obvious reasons. Because in Universe, those with remote weapons are supposed to be multi-attackers.
Or, to the greatest benefit, TAC customization, which gives party-wide effects such as increasing the focus stat a pilot has, which is required to use some of their strongest attacks, decreasing the cost to use special skills, or a natural increase to the rate you earn money and TAC points. Even better, in New Game Plus, what you bought on your previous lap through the game is already unlocked for you, as you can only purchase 1 upgrade per tier in TAC customization per lap. So in the second lap, you can get another from each tier, and in lap 3 you can get the last ones.
Which is made far easier by the fact that New Game Plus? Yeah, every bit of currency earned and spent is refunded right back to you, which makes for an excellent trust fund to do it all again. Hell, New Game Plus? If you put in the time to gather the premium equipment upgrades for the units, you can also carry over a select number of those as well, which increases the more times you've played the game before. You know, in the past I've complained about games with New Game Plus features that do not reward players for playing again. Well, this is the exact opposite of that. The Super Robot Wars games want you to replay them, and give you all the benefits you could want within reason in doing so to make you have an easier time towards playing it casually to re-experience the story. Or alternatively, challenge yourself with higher difficulty tiers.
And there's a purpose for doing that as well. If you play the game through on the hardest difficulty, you are given a new goalpost in the form of SR points that have different completion goals than the previous laps, and in turn give you super rewards for doing so. However, the hardest difficulty is actually pretty impossible if you are not doing it as part of your New Game Plus laps, and is the actual intention to such. Play the game 2 or 3 times to completion so you can get the required currency and upgrades to max out the game's best units, and then challenge yourself to conquer the SR point difficulty and its secret events.
And I did not do that for this playthrough, though I had intended to spotlight it a bit. Well, I kind of screwed up and used the original New Game Plus file for my recording session, as I'd accidentally entered that one and unknowingly saved over the New Game Plus save file on my system. Fortunately, everything secret that you can't do on your first lap through the game is generally available to you instead on the second lap, so if you don't want to go through the extra effort, you have no need to. If you decide to put more time into it all, though, it does reward you. As it is, though, since everything is available on the second lap, I'm going to take advantage of 4 things for a pseudo-perfect run. I am, 1, going to complete all the attack point objectives on each map they are available on to achieve all the secret scenarios. 2, I am backtracking through the story branches to showcase those side stories as equally canon to the bigger story, since the branches all happen alongside each other. 3, I've purchased the DLC which expands the story beyond its original limits, and will thus showcase that as well. With one exception, and that one exception being a Day 1 DLC pack that was never made available to purchase later, and I generally despise those with a passion as it locks off relevant game and story content for no reason. And 4, I went the true ending path for all of this, so we are getting the biggest, baddest, and most challenging endgame experience to make our cast earn their happy endings. Because there is legitimately no other proper way to do so. Meaning I am, for this massive review series, spotlighting over 90 separate game scenarios and stages in Super Robot Wars V, on top of talking about my views on each series involved here, the grand majority of which, to play through, requires a time investment of an hour per stage to watch and read through every story segment and play every map. And it is absolutely worth it to do so.
Anyways, what Soji's delivered is the ERS-100, a backup plan to Earth's recovery that was uncovered on the moon, which is being researched. Unfortunately, the Gamillions, and get used to me constantly mispronouncing that word because, yeah, there are a few different ways to say and pronounce it, have decided now is a good time to bombard Earth directly, the research facility the pair are in getting hit hard. Soji, since his life is on the line, deciding to find a way to strike back. Amidst this, Susumu Kodai, who like everyone else in his story just refers to as Kodai, and I will too past this to do the same, brings the drive core to this same installation, which is revealed to be a ship buried in the deserts of what was once a sea, which is the concentration of all of Earth's efforts at a last chance of salvation. A battleship built from the ground up using technology the alien Sasha's people, called Iskandarians, sent them the blueprints to with another previous herald, named Eurisha, who like Sasha was also mortally wounded in their trip here the previous year. The goal of their actions is to prepare a ship which can make it to the Iskandarians' homeworld, appropriately named Iskandar, where they will meet with Sasha and Eurisha's eldest sister, Starsha, who they hope will bestow upon them the Cosmo Reverse system that can undo the damage that the Gamelan's actions have wrought upon their world.
Why the Iskandarians could not send the system themselves is complicated. For one, if the Shah sisters just gave it to them, humanity would hold no true value or understanding of what they were given, and they would just as likely destroy themselves with it out of irresponsibility. That happens enough in fiction to be believable. Furthermore, just being handed their salvation would give them no motivation to changing to avoid the suffering that was wrought upon them as they had before, as, well, the reason the Gamalians are attacking? Yeah, under order from the Federation High Command, humanity started the war. They attacked first. This genocide of humanity is happening because upon first contact, humanity's vessels struck and killed the ambassadors of peace, or at least the Gamillions considered that such, and of the 3 options of join us, become allies, or die, humanity got defaulted into the death camp.
Brutal! They deserve no mercy. Strike them now, follow them to the base, and kill them, all of them! All of them! No mercy! No mercy!
Thus, this is a test on the Skandarians' behalf of whether humanity truly is worthy of salvation. Whereas if they just gave it to them outright, or saved them from themselves, they could just bounce back and from all the tragedies they suffered, turn into the next version of the Gamillion conquest and oppression. As, again, the Earth Federation already was a fascist state before this. Saving them with no effort gives the survivors rebuilding no reason to reform from that, as opposed to doing the work themselves to make that miracle happen.
The problem of all this, though, is to get to Iskandar and back, it would take them a full year's travel. They have a navigation system that will lead them there, but there's no knowing of the dangers out in deep space, where the Gamelan's own installations are along that path, and they only have a year before the Earth, with no further Gamelan action, will be rendered completely uninhabitable. And with how the Gamelans have devastated all forms of space travel, there is zero way to get enough people off the planet to try and abandon Earth and colonize another world before everyone left on Earth would all die. Even if one ship and one overstuffed crew tried to do that, they'd inbreed within a couple generations and die off entirely. If they cannot recover the Cosmo Reverse system and return to Earth within that 1 year, it will mean the extinction of the human race.
But hey, no pressure, right?
Fortunately, Sasha brought them the last component they needed to get this Earth rescue plan going, the wave motion core that powers the wave motion engine, giving their ship more advanced power and capabilities than the Gamelan's own. So once they get the ship started, they'll be all set to go. The problem is the attack on the base is not helping them in any regards. Soji eventually stumbling into right what he was after, an abandoned mobile suit that looks like it was bolted together from an assortment of whatever they had, with it being run by the ERS-100, the system self-identifying as System 99. And with Soji literally falling into the unit, well, there's a reason I should have renamed him Dingo Egret.
Good morning. Ready for combat operation.
Seriously, if this segment of the game was animated, I'm almost certain that would be 1 for 1.
こいつはまるで空飛ぶ武器庫だぜ。
Thus, Soji and the Vanguard holds off the Gamelan's ground forces, with the unit as Soji describes it being a cockpit bolted into a set of thrusters and then loaded with every weapon available to them at the time. To call the Vanguard overclocked is an understatement, as the machine is only going to tear itself apart with time. But it buys the time they need for Okita and his crew to, with the assistance of all remaining available power left on the planet to ignite it, get the wave motion engine to start up, and raise the ship that will save humanity towards the stars.
That ship's name?
So here's where I get to start gushing about my enjoyment about these properties individually. And we get to start with the source material most of this is based out of right now. Space Battleship Yamato, more commonly known in the West as Star Blazers, with the name being changed because the United States military 70 years later still has a grudge against the name Yamato.
The series was originally conceived in the 1970s by Leiji Matsumoto, a legendary creator, with it containing most of the story elements I've already presented. Aliens attack and devastate Earth, with it a long trip of a single ship to find the means of saving it. The original Star Blazers I actually saw in syndication as a kid, and I really liked it, despite its obvious changes. However, what blew it entirely out of the water is the later adaptation this game is using as its source material, Space Battleship Yamato 2199, which was animated by our friends at Studio Zebek.
The Zebek adaptation is actually one of those rare adaptations that is in every way better than the original. Not only because of the advancements in animation, but there are actual tangible differences between the two. Physical differences to the ship design resulted from fixing plot holes from the original, an improvement in the character tales and dynamics of the cast. There's an actual view into the attacking villain's own society, an acknowledgement that humanity had this all coming to them from their own actions, and they're not just victims in all this. Thus, their journey is as much about digging themselves out of a mess of their own creation. Hell, the actual character dynamics and the development of the relationships of the series in of itself is better. As while the runtime of both series are equal, 21.99 I feel actually uses its time better as it cut the fat of the original. I legitimately can't recommend the remake over the original enough. And that's saying something considering the compilation movie recut of the original series beat out Star Wars at the Japanese box office in 1977. Yeah, the original Star Wars movie got beaten by this franchise at that time.
Plus, the original series and its sequels have their own legitimate problems. This franchise is one of the first out there where the original series was so popular that a sequel movie was almost immediately greenlit, and that movie legitimately angered the entire fandom of the franchise so badly that as an apology, the production company literally greenlit an entire TV series that retconned the movie out of existence, while expanding on its hackjob plot points into a proper full series.
Several modern franchises with entries in them that destroy all merits of the larger content could learn from that. But what was so angering about the movie? It killed off nearly the entire Yamato crew after they let the entire Earth fall back into the same state it was at the start, which made the entire story of the original series 100% pointless. Yeah, as you could probably tell, they had a legitimate reason to be angry, and this was back in the day when production companies actually listened to their core audience and consumers' complaints instead of labeling them all as toxic fans we were marketing the content to begin with. Ironically, this led the second season to retconning out the movie's disastrous decisions and adding in various subplots to continue on from the original, with it considered just as good, if not better than the original show. And it too was remade in 2017.
But you might be asking yourself, why is the name Yamato so relevant and important? Well, that takes us back to what Mamoru did with the Yukikaze, as it was a recreation of a real naval action the original historical Yamato is actually known for. During World War II, the Japanese naval battleship Yamato was one of the most accomplished ships of the Imperial Japanese Navy, it lasting almost to the end of the war in its service record, and it was the last ship of their fleet to sink during that conflict. But that last action in and of itself is astounding and still taught in naval schools today. On April 7th, 1945, the Yamato was crippled in an engagement with an entire American fleet, and in order to permit all of the ships it was escorting to flee the area undamaged, it held off 6 American battleships, 7 cruisers, and 21 destroyers from being able to catch them all on its own.
And you might think I'm saying, oh, you mean it held them from being able to catch up by charging them and making all focus on it for a few minutes before they had too much of a head start. No. Not a few minutes. The Yamato, crippled and alone against 34 American warships, lasted 5 hours. 5 hours before every armament on it was either depleted or smashed by opposing fire, after which the US forces finally were free enough to bombard it until its hull broke enough for it to sink. And it did so because the Yamato wasn't only better designed, but swifter in its movements in the sea than any American ship deployed in the Pacific conflict, so that it ran circles around the opposition.
Tough little ship. Little.
This combined with its prior service record through World War II, where it likewise made a habit of humiliating the American military who used the tactic of bum rushing the enemy opposition by superior numbers as their first and prime tactical approach, is why there's been a lasting grudge. But this also acted as a symbol to the Japanese people that superior numbers does not equal superior power, and better engineering, skill, and tactics will always win out against brute force, which is a staple to the element of many of their series. As even as they lost ground, the Yamato survived until the final naval battle of the war. Regardless of the reality of the war in that Japan were on the side of the Axis powers and an antagonist of it, its service record is astounding, and a source of pride that it represented, at the end of the day, the will to endure and survive no matter the changing tides.
Now, one of the changes from the original to the 2199 series was, in the original, the Yamato was made from the remains of the original Yamato, uncovered as the Earth's seas were evaporated. But the actual wreck of the Yamato was discovered in the oceans off of the island of Kyushu in 1982 as broken in two. The 70 series story decisions played off of them finding the ship in one piece, as they had not discovered it back then. So instead for the reboot, they just built a whole new ship that just shared the name, and hid it in a fake outer shell of a long-beached and destroyed relic of a bygone era as camouflage. Most of the 2199 differences from the original is like that. Logical changes taking into account real-world discoveries and changes in the expectations of storytelling for a modern audience, and the required dynamics that would need to be at play for that. Case in point, several of the character dynamics are different here. Akira Yamamoto in the 2199 series is an extended extra from the original, where the original character she was based on was a one-off man who was made irrelevant quickly because they were an irresponsible idiots on a mission that is literally life and death for their entire race. 2199's reboot, however, has her as a central character, as she has to fight her way into being part of the fighter squadron of the ship because, like Kodai, she wants to honor the loss of her own family by actively fighting to save their home, and eventually proves she's the best pilot of the ship, where they're having a pretty amusing and totally not but kind of sexual tension rivalry with the enemy fighter pilot Melda Dietz, who is also in all regards an ascended extra herself. And Melda's character in turn utilized that way so as to help give the Gamelons an actual culture, racial history, and characterization they didn't have in the 70s series. Yuki Mori, the leading woman of the Yamato franchise, as well as a contrast from her original counterpart, who was an assistant nurse for the ship doctor before being forced by circumstances to take on roles beyond her station. As back in the 70s, women were still trying to get their foot in the door to proper military service and to have a hand in what had in the 20th century been roles dominated by men, even if historically they weren't isolated to that service, the original depiction was actually very progressive because of all those things, even though her fawning over Kodai with obvious attraction wasn't. But the reboot? Things have changed in society so much that having Yuki have that same role and going through that same arc again would be seen as an anachronistic throwback. So instead, 2199 has her start out as the ship's operations officer with her own backstory complicated by a loss of memories. Thus, her own personal story has to do with the question on whether she's actually one of the Shah sisters that she resembles and secretly an Iskandarian. And relatedly, her relationship and interaction with Kodai is on a much more even footing, with the two initially butting heads and bantering, but over time, as they get to know each other, just honestly gelling through their common experiences of losing family and seeking out someone who might understand them. Honestly, I prefer the slow burn relationships these two have in this series and the twist it takes them through, especially in concert with the other dynamics on the ship, such as that of Kodai and Okita. Because of Kodai believing that Okita ordered his brother to his death, he initially blames him for it, an assertion that Okita quickly banishes from his head with the truth of Mamoru's sacrifice, and that originally he'd wanted Mamoru, not Susumu Kodai, as the ship's tactical officer, but felt he owed it to Mamoru and his sacrifice to offer the job to his brother, as a final penance as part of the man's last mission, with the two forming a mentor-student, surrogate father and son, dynamic over time that helps Kodai come into his own and mature before Okita's end.
Going to spoil this for you early, for those of you who have not seen the source material, either of them. Okita is deathly ill, what he has having no known cure, but was placed in charge of this mission because there's literally no one else left in the Earth sphere who is a better commander and tactician than him. The sole reason for Earth's survival in their conflict being because of his battle tactics.
Hell, if he hadn't been overruled by the Earth government, this war literally would never have happened. They removed him from command and had his subordinate fire the shots that set off the war. A war that literally cost him everything, as his son died in the following engagements. The man has literally nothing left. None of them do. But unlike many who would just give up, Okita's a man who has the will to survive with every final breath he takes, and it's that spirit why he makes for an excellent and memorable commander. Juzo Okita is the boss, and one of the things memorialized in material past it.
And oh my yes, has the Yamato been referenced and immortalized across fiction. On top of Kira Yamato, the character for Gundam Seed, taking heavy influence in his battle tactics off of the history and moral themology of the Yamato, it's a trope namer.
Back to the story. As the Yamato launches and heads for space, a hatch on the ship is remotely opened. System 99 hacking the ship's docks and allowing the vanguard on board, to the hostility of the other crew of the ship who didn't expect them to take anyone on board like this. However, they do need the help. So Soji, and Chitose, who are back with the rest of the installation personnel, are permitted to join up. But before the Yamato can leave the system, they need to deal with the Gumlost forces that are entrenched here. Thus they are making their way out to Jupiter, which is surprisingly still under control of the Earth Federation breakaway, the Jupiter Empire.
The Jupiter Empire is, sadly, an under-addressed element of the Universal Century, which isn't as surprising as you might think, as the entry that introduced it, Zeta Gundam, only included the Jupiter energy fleet that was its predecessor in order to shove in the character of Patimus Shirako to have him reset the story away from addressing how the Earth Federation was fascist and move it back to the hypocritical, all the evils of man come from those with special powers, with Shirako as the series' big bad, despite that being one of many things that made no sense in Zeta Gundam for him to have the power he does in the story out of nowhere. I have a lot of grievances with Zeta Gundam. Regardless, in the later end of the Universal Century, like every anti-Earth organization in Universal Century, they started out as opposing the authoritarian government screwing everyone over. They structured themselves over management of the scarce resource out in the depths of space, even though the dwarf planets around Jupiter are very rich in untapped resources, and became an authoritarian communist government, ironically, which thus made them and their domination of all resources the antagonists of the Crossbone Vanguard from the Gundam manga Crossbone Gundam.
Now, I'm going to address my complicated view of the Gundam franchise periodically through this game, but let me get this out of the way. I don't outright hate Universal Century Gundam. I don't even hate the fans that bash all the AU Timeline Gundam series. I actually like more than it. However, I have the biggest critical issues, and the most frustrated by, and see the most narrative problems with stories from the Universal Century timeline, or in regards to series like Gundam Age, series or individuals that bend over backwards to worship the UC timeline with reckless abandon and obliviousness to the severe problems it developed over time. Because every Gundam series that wasn't made with involvement from Yoshiyuki Tomino, with the exception to Gundam Age, is actually critical and showcases through their own stories various criticisms and failings of the UC timeline and how elements of it could have been addressed better than they were. And Crossbone Gundam is no exception. Its story's central conflict is about space colonization presided over by governments who care nothing of the safety of the people, are doomed enterprises that are nothing but a slow genocide to those banished to space. A plot element that gels completely with the reasons for every group that fought the Federation, from Zeon, to Mufti, to the Zanskar Empire, to even the antagonists of the god-awful G-Savior, in why they are in conflict.
Now, if you've not heard of it, as it and a lot of Gundam manga never got imported, Crossbone Gundam is the manga sequel to the movie Gundam F91. F91 itself is a movie condensing of the planned storyline for what was supposed to be an entirely new Gundam series set after Char's counterattack that never got off the ground. But what they had was recycled into that film. Ironically, despite that, it still makes more sense and functions better as a story than Char's counterattack.
Regardless, Crossbone is the story of Kincaid Now and Bararona, actually the characters Seabook Arno and Cecily Fairchild from F91 as adults, fighting the Jupiter Empire and their stranglehold over the outer planets by controlling distribution of the resources needed in the Universal Century to power all Minovsky particle technology that was retconned as a required fuel source for everything in Zeta Gundam. Because the Jupiter Empire is centered around Jupiter, obviously resupply is a near impossibility. Thus, they make use of mass production units designed to be low in power usage. In specific, the pirate-themed Crossbone Gundams, as well as current mass production versions of Seabook's original Gundam F91. The manga, from what has been fan-translated, even though it gets silly at some points, is excellent, and the new characters they introduced, such as Seabook's successor protagonist Tobia Aranox, are fan favorites of those who know of them. Hell, for fans of Double Zeta Gundam, The protagonist of that series, Judao Ashita, actually gets his own cameo as an old man, still piloting a junkier version of the Double Zeta 40 years later.
Fans have been actively positioning for Crossbone and its sequel stories to be made into a full anime adaptation, but there is a reason why Sunrise has been hesitant to do so. And that is because, with the exception to Crossbone, all late and Universal Century content has been disastrous. I just said what happened to F91, but then we have the live-action film Jeeves' Savior. Yes, it counts. Which sucked and made no sense. We have Reconquista in G that Tomino says is set in the same timeline as the Universal Century, even though that makes no sense as it uses elements from Turn A Gundam, and Turn A is explicit in not existing in the same universe as the UC timeline, but in an amalgamated universe of everything set before it, thus both views are not compatible with each other. And of course, Victory Gundam. Victory Gundam being the candidate for the worst Gundam series ever made by Yoshiki Tomino's own admission. The series that almost killed the Gundam franchise due to how unmarketable it is. The series that literally lost the franchise half its audience, causing the ratings of all subsequent 90s Gundam series after it to be a lot lower than they should have been between those who left because of Victory, or because they were UC timeline purists that didn't like the franchise going to new timelines to tell new stories. You want to blame something for why the UC timeline got put to rest for 2 decades, or only told retconned into canon stories in that time? You blame Victory Gundam for why. And please don't send me the excuse that Victory Gundam was awful because Bandai bought out Sunrise during its production. Bandai had long been a sponsor for Sunrise's works long before that point. Victory was half done and Tomino had been screwing up with it before Bandai bought it out, or was even involved in the process of the buyout. Bandai knows better than to screw up with their cash cow creators in that matter, and Tomino himself said they weren't an influencing factor and left him alone in the matter to do as he wanted. And it's Tomino's own actions that screwed it over. People just confuse the two issues because Tomino himself didn't like the company's buyout was happening, not that they messed with him. I have many issues with Yoshiyuki Tomino as a creator, especially as he tends to bash other creative staff for things he himself is responsible for, because he forgot he did those things. But at the very least, when he himself screws up, he acknowledges that he did so, as he's well aware he's not infallible. The problem with that is, he is completely lacking in awareness of how he screws up, or that he is actually more guilty of what he criticizes others for, despite taking credit for doing what they did. And that has led to every other Gundam series not made by him actually having an underlying theme. We're making and building our story off of directly calling out everything that Tomino's work and the Universal Century does badly. Many of his current and modern interviews about how he's progressive and innovative and had a better audience than modern staff, when he's commenting on others' projects, thus always works out the same way. As an old man yelling at a cloud! Because by and large, people have not liked his work or the creative decisions he's been responsible for since the 80s. As he then keeps trying to fix his own story problems with retcons inside non-canon compilation movies, which never works out how he wants them to, as he can miss what was wrong to begin with, nor change the originating sin. As I like to say, you don't get credit for redoing something you screwed up the first time. Now, I probably should be more fair to Tomino, since a lot of his interviews involve the words, "I don't remember," with regards to many of these topics, so it's entirely possible he forgets the context of what he's being asked about and making the off-the-cuff remark that went against his own meanings, goals, or factual information. He would not be the first creator to have that happen to them, and not help that the man turns 80 later in 2021. He should probably have retired over a decade ago. But while I should try to be fair, the problem is, when he's on and off camera for interviews and documentaries, he conducts himself in such a way that it's almost a full 180 and fully contradicts himself. He said a bunch of disparaging things at fan events and in private interviews consistently for decades now that condemn works and creators that are really deserving of attention, as he frequently spouts slander towards them. But fortunately, he's not taken seriously that much these days. After he started savaging basically every modern production that wasn't his, I am not linking any of them because, oh boy, that's a rabbit hole I don't want to travel down. Well, people start to overtly get sick of him, and those who take his word as gospel. And when he made an attack on Attack on Titan's creator for promoting fascist conduct, which, not getting into that either, as that is an entire mess as well, people finally woke up to the realization, Hey, wait. Everything he's accusing Attack on Titan of being is also true for content Tomino himself made, which then led a string of dominoes in modern reevaluation of his stories, to the truth that I stated at the beginning of this. Tomino's Earth Federation UC Gundam is an oppressive, fascist, authoritarian nightmare that is the instigator of every conflict in the universe with how offended parties harmed by their conduct rise up against them, only to be slapped down because the heads of each group are perceived as the bigger evils than those who literally murder anyone that dissents from them. And really, it's evidence of what really pisses me off about the guy and those who talk of his supposed conduct so highly. The entire lack of self-awareness and hypocrisy he regularly showcases, which makes me less tolerant of his works than others. That is not to say you can't like the works he's been part of. I like several series he's been part of, especially the original 0079, but I have little respect for the man these days due to his own lack of it towards others, and his conduct has only increased my aversion to numerous elements of his works that I do dislike.
But hey, that is what Super Robot Wars is here for, to actually allow them a chance at a proper spotlight. Thus, as we make our way to confront the Gamalas out here by first making a pit stop on Mars for additional supplies, we get assistance from Tobiya Aranox and his Crossbone Gundam X1 Kai Kai, who are still out here fighting the Jupiter Empire. Okita, as he's a good commander, has no interest in turning down any help, thus Toby and Kincaid become mainstays for the rest of the game, with Bera and Tobia's own love interest, Bernadette Briette, who is the daughter of the Jupiter Empire's leader, Crux Dogedy, continuing the Universal Century's frustrating insistence on making the grand majority of its protagonists love interests, dethroned, or secret princesses. Anyone who complains about existing in other series like Wing, Seed, or 00, this is where it started, and they kept doing it far more to make it a franchise trope. I'm just happy Seed and 00 did more to subvert the trope than follow it. Anyways, with Bera and Bernadette joining the supporting cast where relevant.
Yeah, both the main and supporting cast for these games are gargantuan, so I'm not going to be able to spotlight every character. Sorry, sometimes it is better to see or read the original stories with this.
Before we move on though, I just have to say that the Crossbone is literally one of the best Universal Century Gundam designs, hands down. Not only is it great with the pirate theme, it's also one of the greatest mobile suits in terms of actually being properly armed and equipped, which UC units very rarely ever are. It has knives in both its feet and stored in its shins. Its skirt armor can turn into 2 different types of grapplers to drag units into close range. It comes standard with beam shields that can convert themselves into punching daggers, has a pistol and beam scimitar that can combine into a stronger rifle, and a larger sword that can also be used as a rifle. And how can I forget the awesomeness that is the Peacock Smasher?
It is literally one of my favorite Gundam units. The only downside to loving the Crossbone Gundam, though, is almost every model of these units is a complete piece of trash or hard to get. The master-grade Crossbone Gundams basically have to be glued together into statues to not be floppy messes, which is also part of the reason why late Universal Century media has failed so badly. Every figure that ties into it completely sucks. Like, don't even get me started on the MG models for the Victory Gundam and V2 Gundam. They fall apart just standing up. And to make it worse for the Crossbones, their hands are so terrible because of how the arms are constructed that they can't even successfully hold their weapons up.
With the resupply on Mars taken care of, the Yamato makes plans to test the ship's FTL engine to jump straight to Jupiter, with Soji finding in the meantime that the Vanguard now has its own combat simulator, a program written by System 99 to help it better understand its pilot and the crew it's part of, which will come into play later. However, since Tobiya brought word that the Jupiter Empire may have found a way to ally and assist the Gamalas, well, we've got to take care of their base before they leave the system, lest we come home to find Crux Dogedy in charge of everything. Soji and Tobiya head out to find their base, only to run right into the Empire testing a new weapon, a mobile suit run by an AI recreation, called a BioBrain, of the original Gundam protagonist, Amuro Ray.
This is something from Crossbone that never quite made sense to me. How the hell did they get a copy of Amuro's brain to flash clone into a subservient AI? I mean, this isn't Genlock where someone downloads their brain into a unit to pilot it remotely. When Gundam Seed and 00 made use of flash cloning a person and transference of consciousness between them into new bodies, for those who don't know about that in Seed, such as more explored in the Astray side stories, The people doing the cloning had access to the consciousnesses of most of the people they were cloning and putting into the new bodies. And if they didn't, then they took advantage of the appearance of the cloned form for psychological warfare to bridge that gap, instead of pretending they did long after they died.
Now, to the defense of the Crossbone manga, it is said that it isn't a real Flash cloning, but an AI programmed with all the combat data from the RX-78-2's original sorties in the One-Year War, featured in the original Gundam 0079. But you'll still have a hard time explaining to me how they got that, considering that unit got blowed up but good by the Zeong in its final battle. No unit Amuro piloted has survived to extract the combat data on it, so this was one of my few hang-ups from the Crossbone series, as the unit the BioBrain pilots, the Amakusa, never made sense to me because of this. But with Kincaid actually joining the party now in a mass-produced F-91, he gets another Crossbone later for those curious, we take out the BioBrain production facility, and one of the last remaining strongholds of the Jupiter Empire, which just leaves the Gamaline's frontline base, an island floating in Jupiter's atmosphere?
If there are living metal monsters that assimilate organics on this thing, I'm out of here. Yes, I know this is from Yamato, not Gundam. It's still really odd to see the Gamillions pull a continent on the surface of a gas giant instead of just employing a space station to siphon resources from it.
As this is their front, a lot of enemy units and ships populate the damn thing, and thus with how much trouble we're causing them, one just tries to suicide crash their ship into the Yamato. This is, however, where System 99 gets involved, hijacking Soji's control of the Vanguard and unlocking use of more of its arsenal, specifically the Vanguard's own anti-ship Macross missile massacre. This also reveals that System 99, who we will now for the rest of the game just call 9, is in fact a sassy lost child in persona with her own huge ego that loves to throw shade on Soji when he doesn't recognize how great she is.
Yes, she, for reasons later shown. And if an AI that co-pilots a giant robot chooses to be female, who is anyone to argue? To be fair, Soji first called her a girl later, and she decided to stick with it as part of, well, finding herself. 9 is a major character in the story, as the reason she calls herself System 99 and not the ERS-100 is her program is incomplete, and she doesn't know what's missing, making her believe analysis of human interaction may be the key to filling in what's left. And a lot of her ego comes from her disguising an inferiority complex she develops over not being the perfect, complete program she was intended to be. Suffice to say, there is a reason why I almost made Soji into a Zone of the Enders reference. Because in that analogy, well, 9 is basically Ada.
But with the immediate airspace cleared of enemies, it's time to test the Yamato's main weapon and its ultimate trope namer of awesome. The Wave Motion Gun, which has since been used in too many things to name all of them.
Acknowledged.
Oh boy.
Lundgren, fire! Perfect cannon! Hassan!
波動砲を使用する。了解。艦首を目標へ向けます。
はい、開きます。放水注入機作動。
最終セーフティー解除。薬室内多気温粒子圧力上昇。ターゲットスコープオープン。艦首軸線に乗った。
タイショック対先行防御。
電影クロスゲージ0度20照準答える。発射まで3、2、1。
波動砲発射。
the Wave Motion Gun, or Yamato Cannon, and the series that inevitably homage it. When you absolutely, positively have to kill every frickin' thing in the galaxy, except no substitutes. Just wait, someday we'll get to use it on the Emperor.
It's important to note, though, that the Wave Motion Gun, that's not something that the Iskandarians gave Earth. That was something the Yamato's builders found from their own extrapolations of the technology, because the Iskandarians did not want them to use their technology like this. As is revealed deep into the series, the Iskandarians in the past did create these weapons, and they abused the hell out of them to the point they almost destroyed everything in the universe, including themselves. This is not part of their test of humanity. They don't trust anyone to possess such power.
Which actually plays heavily into the Yamato series' themes about responsibility and the tests of character humanity is under as they actually expand into space, whether they can use what they learn responsibly. And relatedly, to preserve that morality tale, the Super Robot Wars game's designers explicitly lock out the Wave Motion Gun from being used for 99% of the game. As otherwise, well, let's be honest, players would just spam the damn thing.
Even the game here underscores the power and danger of such a device. That every weapon the Yamato is armed with is to be used first and foremost as a defense against attack. Going out of their way to attack others, after all, is what got Earth into this mess. They won't get out of it by spamming the most destructive weapon in the universe. And as Okita says in the matter, if we follow a just path, we will attract just people, and they shall become our greatest asset.
One of those assets coming from a distress signal they receive as they leave Jupiter's orbit. But I don't think protagonists from Go Nagai and Nagai-adjacent series fit Okita's description.
For as the crew investigates this crashed ship, later revealed in the aftermath to actually be the remains of the Yukikaze when Yuki finds Mamoru's gun in the wreckage and hands it over to Kodai, do they come under attack by a group of biomechanical shapeshifters called Invaders, and their sworn nemesis, the man, the myth, Ryoma Nagare.
Ryoma Nagare is the main protagonist of the Getter Robo franchise. For those who have not heard of it, or only heard of it recently with the announcement and release of Getter Robo Arc, Getter Robo is a 1970s creation of the aforementioned Go Nagai, one of the kings of Japanese manga and anime creation, and also Ken Ishikawa, the latter being the actual writer and decision maker for it, but it better fits the stable of themes of Nagai's work, thus is often mistakenly lumped in alongside it, to the detriment of the recognition of Ishikawa as its main actual creator. Even I am guilty of this, as Ishikawa uses just so many of Nagai's tropes, the two are effectively indistinguishable, as Ishikawa started out as one of Nagai's understudies and assistants, and so the co-creation credit for Nagai likewise not helps this all. And if you're not familiar with him, well, Go Nagai's stable of work is infamous for being nihilistic with their depiction of characters and settings, them often antagonistic towards each other while living in a world without a true hope for a better tomorrow, as something outside of the hero's control or ability to influence will screw over the world every time.
Neither Nagai nor Ishikawa are bad storytellers by any means, but their stories more highlight how, if humanity does not change from how they are, then no matter what we succeed in, we are our own worst enemies and our own one-way sins will destroy us. And why I like such tales from them, as opposed to other creators where I've slammed such misconduct, is, well, one simple fact. Most of the time where that kind of nihilism is spotlighted in a story I hate, it is a result of people being too stupid to understand that they're doing the exact wrong thing in a situation that makes it plainly obvious that they're doing that exact wrong thing. And they could stop doing the wrong thing at any time to save themselves and others because it is in their ability to control or change. But don't because they don't want to, as they're a selfish idiot, and the story's use of such that way makes the entire story around them an idiot plot.
Nagai and Ishikawa's stories avoid that problem. They don't pretend the protagonists are supposed to be always right heroes meant to embody the best of humanity. Just regular people thrust into the jobs. They're going to screw up. Not be the best person out there, but they legitimately try and do what they feel is the right thing from all the information they have to best make a judgment call, instead of doing the wrong thing in spite of knowing what they should be doing is the opposite of what they did. Yeah, I can name many bad creators who think nihilism is having a story where the characters do the wrong thing because it is the wrong thing to do, because it subverts expectations. It's not.
The titular Getter Robo is one of the earliest examples of a piloted giant robot in fiction, and as such the franchise is one of the longest and greatest spotlighted in all of the Super Robot games. With manga extensions to the series, such as Getter Robo Devolution, and the recent announcement of Getter Robo Arc as I record this, still continuing to this day. It is also one of the most influential, bar none, as the Getter Robo is the literal first example of a piloted combining giant robots in fiction.
Giant robots and combining giant robots that lack pilots in fiction actually go back a bit earlier, to the likes of the enemy King Joe in the Super Riot series Ultra 7. But piloted combiners like you see in Super Sentai? No, their source reference all comes from the Getters.
There are, however, divergent timelines for the Getter Robo series, so some details differ, but here are the basics. The Getter Robos are all the creations of a man named Dr. Saotome. They are all powered by Getter Rays, which are background cosmic radiation that Saotome has realized are the key to accelerating progress and evolution and learned to harness them. And their energy is also self-sentient, containing the consciousness and energies of beings who succeeded in evolving into energy beings themselves, and always driving sentient beings to grow and evolve either spiritually, biologically through metamorphic amalgamation, or technologically, with the advancement eventually and always creating a greater entity known as the Getter Emperor, a gigantic, monstrous machine god whose combination literally consumes all matter in a universe, destroys it, and causes a new Big Bang, which irradiates a new universe with Getter Rays to then jumpstart evolution and lead to the creation of a new, different Getter Emperor all over again.
And then the two Getter Emperors fight each other rock'em sock'em robot style until one wins and the stronger of the two consumes the weaker one as the true Getter Emperor. Absolutely none of that is in any way exaggeration. The Getter Emperor is a literal multiversal robot outer god, an existential threat the likes of which makes Lovecraftian monsters and gods tremble in fear and pale in comparison to, as it is the literal will of the universe itself made manifest. And there is literally only one entity in fiction that is more powerful than it. Only one. Which is kind of funny, considering that Getter Robo was a franchise murdered originally by the anime's production company, Toei. I will explain later. It ties into the 3-year rule myth that has destroyed or damaged many of Toei's otherwise profitable properties.
Back on point. This specific Ryoma Nagare comes from the most popular incarnation of the Getter Robo franchise, the OVA series Getter Robo Armageddon from the late 90s. And Ryoma has no idea how he got here. To his recollection, he just got released from jail.
Long story involved, the short version he was framed for Dr. Saotome's murder.
And had to fight an entire legion of Getter Dragon robots from the series Getter Robo G, who amidst his battle with them began to fuse into one massive Getter robot, the Shin Getter Dragon, which is meant to fight off the invaders who in their own right were searching for and evolving through the powers of Earth's Getter Ray reactors. That's why most of Saotome's Getter Robos had been decommissioned before this. Only for Saotome to go completely nuts following the death of his beloved daughter Michiru, and reactivated them all to try fusing them into the Shin Dragon. From there, Ryoma met up with one of his former teammates, Hayato, and alongside a biological clone named Go, took control of the newest Getter robot, the Shin Getter Robo, in order to stop the Shin Dragon and a Getter Ray augmented nuclear missile from destroying the Earth by permitting the invaders unlimited evolutionary potential.
And, well, there's a reason that the OVA series is called Armageddon, or as it's named in Japan, The Last Days of Earth. They fail. and that was only episode 3 of a 13-episode OVA series. Suffice it to say, Getter Robo Armageddon is one of the most dramatic,
But it's too late!
tonally darkest,
Hey, what is it?
thematically nihilistic, and yet amazing mecha anime series ever produced. I highly recommend getting a copy from Discotech's release of the Blu-ray, if only to see a giant robot series where the enemy is literally John Carpenter's The Thing taken to cosmic horror levels. I'm not kidding on that.
Ryoma has no idea how the hell he got here, but when he woke up after the explosion, he found himself beside a damaged Getter Robo Type 1, which he since repaired into usable condition on his own as the Black Getter Robo. And he's not alone, for as Ryoma defends the crew of the Yamato that got stuck out here, another black robot intercedes. This one being the Great Mazinger, piloted by Tetsuya Tsurugi from the classic 70s anime and manga series Great Mazinger, which was also by Go Nagai and animated by Toei.
I will elaborate on the Mazinger franchise later. This video is running long as it is. But the short version of why he's here is he has absolutely no idea as he's lost his short-term memory. What's funny about this is, as I just showed from the clip I used, is Tetsuya actually is infamous for his Getter Robo team-ups, as the Great Mazinger series had canon crossover movies not just with the original Getter Robo anime, but its sequel series Getter Robo G. So, Tetsuya coming to Ryoma's rescue, that's just a recurring thing Tetsuya's done since the 70s. It really puts into perspective Ryoma's response to Tetsuya showing up being, "You're my favorite person in the universe."
Regardless, the Great Mazinger and any Getter Robo ranks highly on the list of most powerful robots in the history of mecha anime, and they make short work of the invaders. In the aftermath, they are invited on board the Yamato, only for both to find that while Tetsuya and Ryoma recognize each other and remember common events where their Earth was attacked by invaders as I just described,
which is not actually that far out there. Both Great Mazinger and Getter Robo G had a crossover movie made by Toei where both giant robots teamed up when their enemies teamed up, and both franchises were the first of their kinds to make canon a shared multiverse where divergent timelines and rebooted iterations of their tales coexist without conflicts over canonicity.
the problem is this is not their Earth. While Yamato's timeline also contains the events of the early Universal Century that happened a century ago from their perspective, for Tetsuya and Ryoma, it was the year UC 0083. Not long after the Federation let the Zeon remnants of the Delaz fleet not only get a nuclear missile-armed mobile suit, which was used to annihilate the Progressive Party of the Feds that wanted to keep the colonies as sane governance, but drop a colony on North America as an excuse to reform the Federation military into the Titans to tighten their control over all of space and commit mass genocide, amidst the invaders' initial assault on humanity, where they took over the moon. However, the Yamato's timeline was never assaulted by the invaders, nor do they have Getter Robo technology, despite Getter Rays existing in their universe, which even allows Ryoma's mech to have power. So it's clear this is all a divergent technology branch that didn't appear here as it wasn't needed. But because of the wave motion technology research having them learn how to fold space and transcend dimensional layers as a means of travel, it is not that out there to presume that Ryoma and Tetsuya, through their own events, got the isekai treatment and were thrown into the closest parallel universe to their own. But with nowhere else to go and everything going to hell, well, Ryoma's the kind of person who can't say no to a fight, and Tsurugi's in for helping as well. So the Yamato finally heads straight for Pluto to deal with the last Gamelan base in the system. And though Pluto may no longer be classified as a planet, while it might be easy to just blow up the hunk of rock to deal with it with the wave motion gun, it would be highly irresponsible. Thus we have to go in ourselves to take out the base and save Earth in the short term. Fortunately, Kodai's team is able to recover a Gamelan android which they use to get information about the base from, and better plan a method of attack.
Or we can just go with Plan R and bash the door down. Yeah, Ryoma is not subtle at all. And yet it entirely works for him, because he's not stupid about it.
Well, we don't even get a chance at that. The Gamelon see us coming and strike the Yamato hard enough that the Yamato needs to dive into the terraformed waters of the Pluto to evade their direct fire. As unknown to them, the Gamelon set up a satellite network of killsats that can bounce an attack from a central installation right at them. Fortunately, mobile suits are too small to hit with this kind of attack. That's actually why earlier naval actions by the Gamelons focused so hard on destroying them. And also them recruiting the Jupiter Empire to get any ones they might have missed. However, with units in range of the satellite cannon, it allows the Yamato's Cosmo Zeros to paint a target on the main installation, so the Yamato can bombard it and destroy it from range, permitting the clearing up of the final stragglers within the system, and allowing the Yamato and her allies to set a course for deep space.
Next time, we've got a lot more characters to recruit and complications to meet as the Yamato's journey to Iskandar truly kicks off. As there's a few other characters that are getting isekai'd into this mess on both sides of the fence.
As the Yamato begins to make strides across the galaxy, further anomalies in deep space lead to meetings of an innovated nature. Betrayed by tentative allies amidst conflicts among the crew, Shoji and Chitose find themselves stranded in another world, and bear witness to the struggles of a young teen fighting to honor his parents' wishes, and a man thought dead returning from the grave. Next time on Super Robot Wars V, Parallel Rail Panic, armed interventions, and the brave hero who rode in on a train.